I never imagined that my life would take such a radical turnaround. My name is Laura, and for 10 years I was a dedicated wife, my husband Carlos, and I had a life that many would consider perfect. We lived in a beautiful house, we had stable jobs, and at first glance, a solid relationship in. However, the reality was different. The routine and monotony began to affect our relationship. Carlos was increasingly immersed in his work, leaving little time for us. One day, in an attempt to find some peace and meaning in my life, I decided to attend the neighborhood church. The community was small but welcoming, and Pastor Juan was a charismatic and energetic man. From the first sermon, I felt that his words touched something deep inside me. He spoke with a passion and clarity that I hadn't found in anyone in a long time. Carlos rarely went to church. He said that Sundays were for resting and preparing for the work week. In part, I was grateful for his absence, because the church became my personal refuge there. I could be myself away from the expectations and responsibilities of home. My relationship with Juan began. Innocently at first, I would simply approach him after services to comment on how inspiring his sermon had been. Little by little, our conversations became longer and deeper. He would tell me about his visions for the community, his personal struggles, and his unshakable faith. For it was my turn to share my frustrations and dreams, things that I could no longer talk about with Carlos. I remember the day everything changed. I had finished a particularly exciting job, and Juan invited me to stay a little longer and help organize some documents. I gladly accepted. We were alone. In his office, surrounded by books and papers, the atmosphere was calm, almost magical. We talked for hours, completely forgetting the passage of time. When we said goodbye, he took my hand and looked me eyes with an intensity that left me breathless. From that moment, something changed between we. Our encounters became more frequent and increasingly personal. What started as a friendship turned into something deeper and more forbidden. We began to see each other outside of church, in discreet cafes and out-of-the-way parks. Each encounter was a mix of emotion and guilt. I knew that was playing with fire, but the feeling of being wanted and understood was too addictive to resist. The first time I was alone with Juan outside of the church setting, it was completely unexpected. He had finished an inspiring sermon, and as I was heading towards the exit, he approached with a warm smile. "You would like me to take you home? I can give you a ride." As said, naturally my heart skipped a beat, and although I knew it wasn't right, I accepted without hesitation. During the journey, the conversation flowed with surprising ease. We talked about life, our dreams, and frustrations. He talked about his vocation, how he had decided to dedicate his life to the service of others, and the difficulties he faced along the way. I felt touched by his honesty and vulnerability. He was a passionate and genuine man, something I had missed in my relationship with Carlos. We arrived at my home, but instead of saying goodbye immediately, we stayed in the car talking. Time flew by, and when we finally realized the time, it was already late. We said goodbye with a handshake that lasted a little longer than normal, and a spark lit something in my heart. His gaze made me feel wanted and understood, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. From that day on, our interactions at church became more frequent and personal. I always found an excuse to approach him after services, and he always seemed to have time to me. We became closer, sharing confidences and supporting each other in our struggles. One day he invited me for a coffee after the service. "I need to talk to you about some church projects," he said. I accepted without thinking twice, even though I knew there was something more behind the invitation. We met in a small, cozy cafe away from the prying eyes of the community. The conversation started with trivial matters, but quickly turned to more personal issues. We talked about our lives, our passions and fears. Juan listened to me with an attention and empathy that made me feel special. His every word seemed to be aimed at my soul, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. As our encounters became more frequent, the tension between us grew. There was an undeniable chemistry and attraction impossible to ignore. I began to long for these moments alone with him, wanting his presence more than he should. The guilt and euphoria mixed in my heart, creating a storm of emotions that I didn't know how to deal with. The relationship with Juan turned into something deeper and more forbidden. We saw each other in secret, always afraid of being discovered. But the emotion of the clandestine only made our encounters more passionate. Carlos continued without suspecting anything, busy with his own affairs. Every time I was with Juan, I felt a mixture of guilt and euphoria, knew he was playing with fire. But he couldn't stop the pastor. Everything my husband had stopped being attentive, loving, and above all made me feel alive. Our relationship intensified with each into the first time we kissed. It was in his office after a long day of work. At the church, we were reviewing some documents when suddenly our eyes met, and the tension became unbearable without saying a word. I approached him, and our lips met in a kiss full of passion and contained desire. It was a magical moment, but also terrifying. I knew that what we were doing was wrong. But I couldn't contain myself. We started looking for more opportunities to be together. Juan organized church meetings, at times he knew would be convenient for us. We found excuses to see each other outside the church in discreet places where no one knew us. Each meeting was a risk, but also an explosion. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. The situation got complicated when Juan suggested that we meet at his house. At first, I hesitated, knowing that this increased the risk of being discovered even more. But the temptation was too strong. We met at the showroom, and for the first time, we had the freedom to be together, without worrying about being seen. It was a night of tenderness, and although I knew I was making a mistake, I couldn't help but feel happy. However, not everything was perfect. The guilt started to affect me more and more every time I was with Carlos. I felt like an imposter. He was still the man I had married, but I was no longer the same. My heart was divided between two men. And although I knew I had to make a decision, I was not prepared to face the consequences. Sunday, Carlos decided to accompany me to church. Without prior notice, I was nervous, but it tried to act naturally. I had been very careful, but Carlos's presence changed everything during the service. I felt that Juan's eyes were looking for me with more intensity than ever, and I could barely maintain my composure when these munded. Carlos was chatting with some acquaintances while I approached Juan to discuss some church matters. The tension between us was palpable, but we managed to keep up appearances. Or at least that's what I thought. After the service, Carlos suggested that we got a lunch with some friends from church. It tried to dissuade him, but he persisted throughout the meal. I noticed that Carlos was watching my interactions with Juan more closely than usual. I felt at wingy of worry, but it tried to act normally that night. Carlos confronted me. "Is there anything I should know?" he asked, his voice full of suspicion. My heart raced and the guilt hit me hard. I shook my head, trying to remain calm, but I knew I couldn't hide the truth for much longer. From that day on, Carlos started to attend church more regularly. I felt this gaze fixed on me all the time. The tension between us grew, and our secret relationship became increasingly difficult to manage. One afternoon, after a particularly tense service, Carlos suggested we hold a meeting at our house to discuss some church projects. I couldn't refuse, although I knew that would only complicate things. We invited several members of the congregation, including Juan, on the night of the meeting. It tried my best to normally prepare dinner and make sure everything was perfect. However, throughout the night, inquisitive gaze on me. Juan also seemed more reserved than usual, avoiding eye contact with me. At the end of the meeting, Carlos offered to take Juan home. At the door, saying goodbye to the other guests. As I watched them leave, the tension in the air was palpable, and I knew that something would change. One Sunday morning, Carlos decided to go to church without telling me. He arrived early, before I had even left the house. When I arrived, he was already sitting there, in one of the front pews. I was surprised to see him, but it tried to act naturally during the service. I had difficulty concentrating. I could feel Carlos and Juan's eyes on me, and the tension was almost unbearable. After the sermon, Carlos was talking to some acquaintances as she used to do. Meanwhile, I approached Juan to discuss some pending matters of the church. We retired to a far corner of the room where we believed we would have some privacy. Juan took my hand, and we started talking and laughing, trying to forget for a moment the pressure we felt. However, I didn't realize that Carlos was watching us from afar. Suddenly, I saw Carlos approaching. Your eyes were full of questions and distrust. "What is happening here?" he asked, his voice shaking with contained anger. Juan tried to calm the situation, but his every word only made things worse. "Laura, what is this?" Carlos insisted. His voice was now louder. I tried to let go of Juan's hand, but it was too late. Carlos, seeing my silence, understood the gravity of the situation. "That's what you've been doing," he said, looking at me with eyes full of pain. My silence was the only response he could get. Carlos didn't take long to confront Juan directly. His faces showed a mixture of disbelief and fury. "How dare you do this in the house of God?" he shouted, grabbing Juan by the collar of his shirt. The faithful hurried to separate them, but the damage was already done. Juan's public confession had exposed our relationship in the most brutal way possible. It tried to intervene, but my words were drowned in the chaos. People surrounded us, whispering and looking with eyes full of judgment. I felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. Carlos looked at me, his face upset by betrayal. "I can't believe you did this," said before. After leaving the church, the scene was engraved in my memory like a constant torment. The image of Carlos full of pain and anger and Juan defeated and humiliated was something I could never forget. I knew I had destroyed everything that had once been important to me. The pastor, in a desperate attempt to control the situation, decided to speak to the congregation. "My dear brothers and sisters, I am deeply sorry that you had to witness this. Laura and I made mistakes, but I want you to know that she is an incredible person and that I care deeply about her." The words echoed in the church hall like a deafening echo. Carlos, enraged, advanced towards him. "This is an insult, a betrayal of the worst kind," he shouted, pushing Juan back. The faithful intervened quickly, separating them before the situation became even more violent. The public confession of Juan had exposed our relationship in the most brutal way possible. Carlos looked at me once again, his face full of disbelief and pain. "I can't believe you did," he repeated, and left me alone in the middle of the turmoil. The congregation was in shock. I felt the looks of everyone on me, judgmental looks of compassion and contempt. I knew there was no going back my life. As I knew it had ended at that moment, the journey home was silent and tense. Carlos didn't say a single word, and I didn't know how to break at the ice of his fury and pain. When he arrived, he went straight to the room and started to pack his bags. "I can't live like this," Laura said. "Finally, I loved you, I trusted you. But this is unforgivable." It tried to explain, asking for forgiveness, but every word seemed empty and without sense. I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no return. Carlos left home, and with him went a part of my life that I could never get back. That night, I was alone in our house, surrounded by the memories of our life together. Every corner reminded me of Carlos, and the weight of my betrayal became unbearable. I knew I had destroyed what we built, and the guilt consumed me. The divorce was quick and painful. Carlos didn't want to prolong the suffering, and I didn't have the strength to fight. The news spread quickly in our community, and I became the subject of everyone's gossip. I lost my husband, my home, and the respect of those who once looked up to me after the divorce. It tried to rebuild my life, but it was difficult. Community saw me as an outcast, and the whispers and judgment looks were constant. Juan was transferred to another parish, and our lives took separate paths. Reflecting on everything that happened, I realized how fragile trust can be and how devastating the consequences of our decisions are. Loneliness became my constant companion. I dedicated myself to finding a new purpose, seeking to redeem myself somehow. I started volunteering at a women's help center, trying to find some meaning amidst the chaos of my life. Helping others gave me a small sense of peace. Although the pain of my betrayal never completely went away, one day, while organizing an event at the help center, I met a woman who had been through a similar situation. Her words resonated with me in a profound ways. Sometimes we make mistakes that destroy us, but that doesn't mean we can't find a way to heal and move forward. These words gave me new perspective. I knew I could never undo the damage I had caused, but I could try to learn from my mistakes and build a better life. Little by little, I began to forgive myself, understanding that redemption was not something I could get from others, but something I had to find it within myself. Now, as I tell my story, I hope it serves as a warning to those like me who play with fire without considering the cost of their actions. Life is too short to be lived in the shadow of guilt and regret. I learned, although it is too late, that betrayal, no matter how exciting it may seem at the moment, only brings destruction and regret. My story is a reminder that we must value what we have and be aware of the decisions we make. Trust is a precious asset, and once it is broken, it is almost impossible to repair. In my case, the lesson was learned in the most painful way possible, but I hope that others can avoid my fate by learning from my mistakes today. I continue my work at the help center, trying to make a difference in other people's lives. Although the past still weighs on me, I found a way to move on and no longer seek forgiveness from others, but I learned to forgive myself. Carlos moved on with his life, and I heard he got married again. I sincerely hope he has found the happiness he deserves. As for Juan, he will never do it again. I have seen or heard about him since he was transferred. Sometimes I wonder what our life would have been like if we had made different choices. But I know that there is no point in living by. And if my journey of healing and self-discovery continues, every day is an opportunity to be a better person, to make wiser choices, and to value the relationships I have in my life. I have learned that true love is not about blind passion or intense emotions, but about respect, trust, and commitment to those who may be facing similar temptations. I implore you to think twice about the price of betrayal is too high, and the wounds it causes may never completely heal. It is better to face the problems in your relationship head on or have the courage to break up before getting involved with someone else. My story may not have a happy ending in the traditional sense, But I found a form of peace. I hope that by sharing my experience, I can help others to avoid the same mistakes and to value what really matters in life, love, trust, and integrity.